limit it to 1.5 degrees, you need to change a lot in the way that you use land, energy, industry, buildings, transport, and cities. And if you're going to do that, they said, you need to be down at net zero emissions by about 2050. So as a result of that, the UK government asked the Committee on Climate Change to look at whether the UK should adopt a net zero target. And their report concluded that that should be the case. And so just before Theresa May lost her position as Prime Minister, the government passed through Parliament a legally binding target to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Greenhouse gas emissions is the critical thing. I will very often talk about carbon or carbon dioxide because that's the major proxy that dictates most of those. Now, since the government passed its target here in the UK, net zero targets have been announced by a number of major economies, including China, the EU, within the EU, France and Germany, Korea and Japan. And with Biden's election, it looks very probable the US will do the same thing. Now, the fact that those people have announced that they're going to do it is significant because this plot of CO2 emissions by region of the world shows that if you look in the red bar, which is China, the turquoise bar, which is the United States, the yellow chunk, which is the EU 27, and the orange chunk, which is the rest of Europe. And then towards the top in the rather muddy purple color, Asia, a lot of that is Japan and Korea in the industrialized countries, as well as the less industrialized ones. So those are the major emitters. And that's quite an important feature because if they don't play, it doesn't make much difference. If you actually look at the figures, and this shows historical emissions of carbon dioxide, remember that's a proxy for greenhouse gases, it's not quite all greenhouse gases, then you can see that China is roughly double the emissions of the United States at the moment, and the UK is right down there amongst the tiny people. So the UK's emissions by themselves are not particularly big contributors to world emissions. It's those big players that have got to change. If we look at where the UK's emissions come from, and this is based upon the fuels used, you'll see that historically it was predominantly and almost exclusively coal, but since the middle of the last century, we've seen a growth in, first of all, oil and then natural gas, which form the bulk of the emissions. And if you look at the UK's emissions today, they're predominantly oil and gas, with a small amount coming from some of the big industries. If we contrast that with the United States, then they've still got quite a lot of coal emissions, although they are reducing. They've got substantially more oil emissions, and they've got emissions coming from natural gas, which have been growing over approximately the last 35 years and started in the US in around the time of the Second World War, because they had access to natural gas reserves which they could exploit before the UK did. And then if we contrast all that with China, China's emissions started very much later than everybody else's, really only coming into any significant amount in around 1960. And over that period, you'll see that there has been a dramatic rise, particularly over the last 20 years, in the emissions from coal. And that's because China has very little in the way of indigenous oil and natural gas. It's got a lot of indigenous coal, so that's what they use to power their industry, but also housing and many other things. Oil is predominantly used in transport. And these are the same three graphs, just side by side, just to give you a quick chance to compare them by eye. And I think the point that you bring out is coal in China, a very large quantity, not diminishing, of oil in the United States, and in the UK, the virtual disappearance of coal, leaving a residual quantity of oil for transport and gas for a lot of other purposes. Now let's switch to the UK. And it's important to recognize that the UK is driven predominantly in all these actions by the Climate Change Act passed in 2008. This was the first instance of a country introducing legally binding emissions reductions targets and a framework. And the framework that's been used has now been copied to some extent by a number of countries. On the slide, it says France, Denmark, Sweden, and Mexico, but actually China is putting elements in place. Japan's talking about it. So as a way of approaching it, it's received quite a lot of attention internationally. And what exactly is it? Well, there are three major parts to the Climate Change Act. The first is that it sets a target, and the target now, after June 2019, says that the UK is committed to achieving a 100% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. The second element is it says that in order to do that, there's going to be a series of carbon budgets or greenhouse gas emission budgets, each of which lasts for 5-year periods. And the third part is that it's independently scrutinized. So there's an independent committee on climate change, which has got two roles. One is to actually recommend to the government what those carbon budgets should be. And the second major element is it evaluates the progress that's been made and highlights where that progress may not be sufficient. Now, if we look at what's happened over the period that we've had this in place, this is not a particularly good color graph. So let me just draw your attention to two lines. The first is the purple line running along at about 70 or 80 in terms of emissions. That's million tons of CO2 equivalent. And that purple line is emissions from the built environment, mainly from homes. And the second one is the one that runs along at about 130, the black line, and that is emissions from transport. And those are characterized by the fact that broadly, they have stayed more or less constant over the last 30 years, whereas the other lines, which cover emissions from electricity generation, that's the one with the very sharp drop off in the last decade, have gone down quite a lot. Emissions from business and industry have fallen notably as well, starting originally from the highest base. And then we've got emissions from natural resources. That's emissions from land, from waste, and many other things. And emissions from land are quite an important part of this, but I'm not going to spend much time talking about that. Now, in spite of the fact that those emissions have gone down, in contrast to most of the years preceding 1980, during that period, GDP has continued to rise, as shown by the top red line, and the bottom pink line is the fall in emissions. Up until about 1990, emissions and GDP more or less rose in sync. There was a direct correlation between them. And so the measures that have been taken have actually brought about that fall, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. The blue lines in the middle show what's happened to the G7 group of countries. Their GDPs have risen at roughly the same rate. Their emissions have decoupled, but not to the same extent that has happened in the UK. And that's for historical reasons, a lot of which is to do with industrial structures and the way that we generate electricity. So now let's talk about the carbon budgets that I mentioned earlier. This plot shows in the horizontal lines above each colored period what the carbon budget is for that period. So the periods are 5 years. The carbon budget gives a total amount of emissions allowed to be emitted over that 5-year period, and the horizontal lines simply are 1/5 of that total amount for each year. The vertical lines show up to 2018 what the emissions actually were, and beyond 2018, they are the projections of what they are expected to be on the basis of measures that have been taken so far, or the measures that are in hand to be taken. So that's the technologies, the policies, and other things that we've got. So the one thing that you need to see from that is, first of all, we've hit the budgets over the period since the Act came into force in 2008, but the projections, starting with the 4th carbon budget period, that's the red lines, show that the budget is actually less than the projected emissions. And the same is true for the 5th carbon budget period. What that tells us is we're going to need to do something different if we're going to meet those budgets. And that's a lot of what government policy is currently doing. Now, right on the right-hand edge, I've left in the vertical bar that shows what was the target, which is an 80% reduction. That's where we needed to get to. But now, of course, we've got to get down to 0 by that point. And that presents a whole lot of challenges. As a colleague of mine used to say, up until 2019, everybody presumed that they were going to be in the remaining 20%. Now there isn't a 20% to hide in. So what does that mean? This is the recommendation from the Committee on Climate Change for what the emissions profile should be, and specifically what should be the budget for carbon emissions in the 6th budgeting period. That runs from 2033 to 2038. And that is the purple block on the right of this graph. The green and blue blocks show you the preceding carbon budget periods, and the black line shows you the emissions that have actually been achieved. The little shaded bits are to do with international aviation and shipping, and that's a detail we don't need to worry about for this. It's an argument about exactly what's accounted for. Now, what you can see from that is the dotted line shows the projected pathway to net zero. And you can see that the proposed budget for that 6th period would represent a substantial reduction of about 40% on the budget for the preceding period. And the rate at which those emissions have got to go down is accelerating from what's been achieved so far. So how might that be done within the UK? So the first thing, it means that we've got to decarbonize all of the sectors of the economy. And you'll recall from the graph of what we've managed to do over the last 30 years, that means we've really got to start hitting emissions from buildings, from transport and various other areas, including the use of land. And that will come into things about diet that I'll touch on in a moment. In order to do that, there's going to need to be the utilization of technologies that we're currently either not using or don't have at a suitable state to use. That includes carbon capture, utilization and storage, the first one, the use of hydrogen as a zero carbon energy vector. We're going to need to find a way of making greater use of biomass. And in all probability, we're going to actually need to remove greenhouse gases that are already in the atmosphere. And we're going to need to do that so that we can take them back and sequester or in some other way lock them up. And what those are is essentially using carbon capture and storage with biomass feedstock and possibly even direct capture from the air of the carbon dioxide. It's going to mean a massive increase in zero carbon electricity production. And it's estimated that this is going to cost the country somewhere in the region of 1 to 2% of its gross domestic product to implement this, because none of these things are as cheap as the systems we currently use. So how's the government laid it out? And this is the policy framework. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about policy. Well, here are 4 relevant documents. The first is the Energy White Paper that was published in December. The next is the 10-point plan that the Prime Minister announced in November. And then for historical purposes, I've added 2 other documents, the Clean Growth Strategy from 2017 and the Green Finance Strategy from 2019, which were the previous attempts at doing it. So what are they? Well, the Energy White Paper is the government's thoughts on how much different forms of energy and energy in total do we think we need going forward? Who's going to pay for it? And how are they going to pay for it? And the third element is how do we make that happen? So this is about policies and approaches to actually make some of these changes go forward. The 10-point plan was some might say, typical prime ministerial announcement, in that it had lots of buzzwords, but it didn't actually say anything about how it was going to be done. But it's worth just rapidly running down what those 10 points were. They were to do a lot more with offshore wind. The second one was to develop the use of low carbon hydrogen as an integral part of the energy system. The third was to deliver new nuclear power capabilities, not simply building more of what we've got, but actually advancing the technology of nuclear. The fourth was to bring about zero emission vehicles. The fifth was to find ways of greening public transport and encouraging everybody to cycle and walk more. The sixth was about zero emission aviation and what are called green ships. Ships currently emit twice the greenhouse gases that all of the world's aircraft do, and their use is growing. So this is quite an important point. The seventh was to make our buildings much less emitting, both by increasing efficiency of their thermal operation, but also by bringing about different ways of heating and cooling them. The next point was investing in carbon capture, usage and storage, and the key word there is investing. The ninth point is protecting the natural environment. And finally, it was green finance and innovation. And innovation and green finance is really the enabler for all the things that come before that. Now, very quickly, it's worth looking back at what the Clean Growth Strategy in 2017 said. It was a policy structure that said, this is how we'll bring about clean growth. The point about this document was that other than saying I'm going to stop selling petrol and diesel cars by 2040, which has now been moved forward to 2030, it didn't say much other than we will say what we're going to do to bring about these improvements. So it said we're going to invest more in renewables, we're going to have public sector demonstration, we're going to bring about business energy efficiency, but it didn't actually have specific measures to do it. Okay, let's talk about what it might all mean then. So this is an image that was produced by the Energy Systems Catapult just over a year ago, looking at what zero carbon life might be like. And what this diagram shows is what the carbon footprint is of a typical household. So it's not necessarily just the emissions from the house. This is about the emissions caused by the people living in a household. And we started in 1990 with the big block on the left. The size shows what the typical greenhouse gas emissions were. And you can see from that that the biggest single chunks were heating and transport. And the remainder came from the use of electricity, emissions from our diet and the agriculture, emissions from waste, and right down at the bottom, a little bit from aviation. And then it shows how that's developed through to 2017, which was the time when they had data. And what I think we can pull out from that is two major points, which is firstly that there have been a substantial increase in transport. There had been a threefold increase in the aviation emissions because we were all going on holiday more. And there was the start of a rise in emissions from diet and agriculture. And then going over to the right, these are scenarios for 2050. And the one that we're interested in is the one at the top, the very smallest diagram. And what that shows is under a viable net zero scenario, this is not a prediction, it's what might happen. What it shows is that for the average household, their individual carbon footprint would be made up predominantly from their use of aviation. The next biggest element would be their diet and what they ate. There would be a little bit from heating and waste in the household, and electricity, which is the yellow blob, has almost totally disappeared at the bottom right-hand side of that diagram. So if you compare 1990 with that scenario, this is a dramatically different change of where the residual emissions are. But the other important point to see is that the emissions of those individuals have dropped by something in the region of 93% in total. Okay, let's talk a little bit about how we currently supply energy that we use. And this energy that I'm going to talk about for a moment is electricity. This shows the variation in the consumption of electricity in the, well, in Great Britain. It's not the UK, it's Great Britain. So it excludes Northern Ireland, over a period of 5 years, which shows the seasonal variation in electricity consumption. But it also shows that by the blurriness of the line, you can see that there's quite a variation through the day. And typically you get about a 35% reduction from the peak consumption overnight in the winter. And in the summer, that reduction in peak consumption can be 60% or more because there's less used in the warmer weather. If we look at the contribution of wind over that same period, you can see that it is a finite and growing, but still not particularly large contributor to the supply of the energy. And I should make clear here, we're talking about energy, not power. This is the total amount of energy on a daily basis. If we now look at all the other sources of energy, not just electricity, this is more or less the same plot, but it's now got 2 extra bits on. The ragged blue line is the consumption of gas, the total consumption of gas, excluding gas that we produce and export, obviously. And the grey line in the middle is the consumption of liquid transport fuels. And there are 2 key areas that I'd just like to pick up from this plot. The first is that you can see that gas consumption in terms of energy supplied is typically of the order of 3 to 4 times the amount of energy that we supply through electricity. And that transport, as you will have deduced from emissions, is almost twice the amount of energy that we consume in electricity. You'll see towards the right of that graph, it goes through the period of the various lockdowns last year, and there was a dramatic fall in the fuel consumption over that period because people were traveling less. So that gives you an idea of how much of that total fuel is used both for commuting and for personal uses. The other thing I'd like to point out is the thing with the red arrow towards the left of the graph, which is the period in 2018 when we had the extremely cold weather, when there was a surge in gas demand. And that surge is quite important when it comes to looking at technically how we might meet our energy needs in the future. This graph is all about gas. And the blue line at the bottom is the consumption of gas on a daily basis. And the bit above it is the storage of gas in the UK that is used both to stabilize the supply, but also act as a reserve. And I've put this in for 2 reasons. The first is that if you look at the period with the red arrow in 2018, when we had the very cold snap, the storage available got down to virtually a single day's supply of gas. Now, we cannot supply all of our needs by instantaneous production from the North Sea. So storage is quite an important part, and the skill of running some of these aspects of the energy system is about making sure that balance is in. The second thing that you'll see is there's a steadily decreasing amount of storage going on. The other thing I'd like to say about gas, this is a plot over a particular winter's day, and it shows in the orange line the consumption of gas through that day. And you'll see that where that orange line is at its lowest, that's about 4 o'clock in the morning. And then what I wanted to point out is what happens between approximately 5 a.m. and 8 a.m. to the consumption of gas. It goes from 3.5 to approaching 20. That is a dramatic swing in rate of supply and is one of the key characteristics of a gas network in the UK, which is how do you cope with balancing instantaneous demand? Now, a lot of you will know that there's talk about moving our electrical system towards a system that is much more distributed resources. This just shows one diagram. We don't need to go in detail, but the white blocks show two things. One is distributed power generation, and the second is storage, which you need if that power generation is going to go be handled correctly. And the storage that is being talked about for electricity is a variety of technologies, which are shown on this slide here. And you'll see that batteries are an important, but not the only technology that you need. And particularly when you're thinking about coping with some of these dramatic swings in demand, you can see that probably batteries by themselves are never going to be able to cope with that energy demand were we to seek to eliminate emissions from gas and move just towards electricity and renewables, because the components of storage that we'd need to cope with the swing we just looked at are literally vast. Carbon capture and storage, which is another element, is a key factor in how many countries are going to try and seek to reach zero emissions, because they cannot stop using fossil fuels. The system balance just doesn't work if you do that. Now, this is a picture of carbon capture and storage. I'm sure you're familiar with it. But the key issue about this is how we can utilize the geological structures to sequester carbon over long periods safely and without concern that there may be unintended effects. There's lots of work going on about that. Everybody is confident it can be done, but there's still a lot that remains to be proven before we actually do it. We also mentioned hydrogen, and hydrogen is one of the areas that we might meet these targets. It's a zero carbon vector. You can either transmit it as hydrogen, you can transmit it as ammonia, you can transmit it as metal hydride. There's a variety of ways you can do it. I put this slide up because in 2016, Northern Gas Networks published the results of a very detailed engineering study that said, can we use our existing gas network to move hydrogen around if we've got it? The answer was yes, we can, if we wish to do it. The only thing it doesn't do is it doesn't cope very well with that 5 a.m. to 8 a.m. swing, because the amount of energy you can store in hydrogen by compressing it within the network limits, isn't quite enough to meet that. So that's an unsolved problem that's got to be done. They imagined the hydrogen would come by combining steam methane reforming with carbon capture and storage and putting the carbon dioxide somewhere, leaving the clean hydrogen to use. I mentioned earlier also the need to improve the efficiency and operation of housing. And this is probably the biggest challenge that all countries face in going towards a net zero system. Because the issue in many places is that we need to retrofit existing houses that were constructed at a time when energy consumption and emissions simply wasn't an issue. So some of the aspects of doing that are really challenging if you're going to do it technically efficiently, but also get a cost-effective solution. And particularly with solid walled buildings, SWI on the slide is solid wall insulation, and insulating under floors is both expensive and disruptive to do. It needs specialist knowledge and skills. And given that in the UK, we have 30 million dwellings that are going to need refurbishing, and we've got to refurbish them by 2050, that means we've got to do 1 million houses a year with this rather complex process. And if you look at the manpower requirements to do that, as well as the costs and who's going to pay, That's quite a challenging issue. Similar challenges are faced in other countries, even though they're expressed slightly differently. Transport is also a big problem, and transport comes in mainly in the field of freight transport, whether it's by road or by ships, as I mentioned earlier. Cars are actually not too much of a problem, because we know that we can use batteries to power cars over ranges that are now reliably getting towards about 200 miles, and we can expect that we can probably aspire to a range approaching 350 to 400 miles over the next decade. So cars aren't the problem, we have a technical solution. What we don't have at the moment a good technical solution for is lorries and ships, and particularly trains in areas where you can't afford to put in a fixed electrical infrastructure to electrify the line. Ships are moving towards the concept of using ammonia as the production system, and the Global Maritime Forum is running an exercise with about 45 ship operators, fuel suppliers and ports to actually start putting ammonia infrastructure in to enable ships to be converted. The solution for heavy freight is still not apparent. There are people talking about things like trolleybus wires going up down motorways, but I don't quite believe in that. I'd like to spend just a minute or two talking about nuclear power as a means of electricity production, but other energy production. So in the Climate Change Committee's report about net zero in 2019, they looked at what the contribution of nuclear might be. And on this plot, this shows where electricity might come from in a net zero scenario. And the red blob at the bottom is variable renewables. That means offshore wind. There's a bit of bioenergy, carbon capture and storage. The green is the nuclear plants we've already got, and the grey above that is new nuclear plants. And then the rest is basically gas with carbon capture and storage on. So you'll see that even in that scenario, nuclear's not got a particularly large role, but more importantly, a lot of it is new nuclear, stuff we don't have at the moment. Now, in doing that, we've got a number of challenges. Nuclear is great, it's a zero carbon source, but it's costing a lot and it seems to keep costing more. So if we look at Hinkley Point, the original cost of that was £18 billion. The current estimate is now running at 23 and a half, not 22 and a half, as the slide says. Two plants in the United States at Vogtle, which were part of the new generation of nuclear power that was being developed for low-cost construction, started 12 years ago with a cost estimate of $14 billion. They're now running typically 5 to 6 years late with a cost of $25 billion. And the plant at Flamanville in France, which is the prototype for Hinkley Point C, its original cost was $3.3 billion. The cost estimate now is $12.4 billion and probably still rising in truth. So the capital cost and the delays in construction are a major barrier. However, we don't have to use reactors just for producing electricity. If we have high temperature gas-cooled reactors and molten salt reactors, they operate at much higher temperatures, and that means that you can produce heat that's useful for industrial use. The current generation of pressurized water reactors with heat at about 300 and 350, frankly, are not much use for industrial applications. But if there was higher temperature heat, then you can start to imagine them being used in desalination, oil refining, ethanol production, and hydrogen production, as well possibly as district heating. Now, some of these applications are of major importance in parts of the world where currently they don't have nuclear power, but they will need to make their contribution to zero carbon as well. On hydrogen production, what could you do? Well, you can do it in two ways. If you've got any heat, you can use it to assist in steam methane reformation, but that's still a process that requires carbon capture and storage if it's going to be clean, and that's quite a major cost barrier in itself. It does, however, reduce the amount of natural gas you need. Much more interesting is if you can get up towards 1,000 degrees, you can start to use high temperature thermochemical production, such as the iodine sulfur cycle. And that's a route that's being pursued quite aggressively in Japan and in China, as well as some other countries who are keen on nuclear, such as Korea and the United States. So just to summarize that, for nuclear, it's got a big challenge, but a big potential role in the future. The challenge are how much it costs and how long it takes to deliver. And the technique that's being pursued in the UK to try to solve that is support for small modular reactors, which are supposed to be factory produced. I should say small is a relative term to other reactors being built today. The reactors being proposed are typically the size of a Magnox power station, so they're not small in absolute sense. There's a question about how do you finance them, and the problem with nuclear is that you have to spend on building it for many years before you get any revenue from it, and that has proven a major barrier in getting private sector finance. So the idea is something called a regulated asset-based model, which I'm not going to talk about in detail, which transfers the financing risk onto the consumer. And also it's believed small modular reactors, because they're faster to construct, ought to carry that out. And then the final issue is that the thermal output. Temperatures today are too low for nuclear to play a particularly big role in the areas that need to be decarbonised. Electricity is not really a problem on decarbonisation. It's how do you contribute to decarbonising those other sectors by producing hydrogen or giving yourself other forms of heat that can be used. The other thing that's chasing nuclear is the fact that offshore wind in the UK has proved astonishingly successful at reducing costs. In 2015, if you wanted to buy a megawatt hour of offshore wind, it cost you about £125. In the auction in 2019, people were prepared to contractually commit to delivering it at less than £40 per megawatt hour. So that's a 2/3 fall in price in a period of 5 years, which is quite astonishing as an engineering achievement. Now, just go back onto the international scene. Mentioned Mission Innovation briefly. Mission Innovation was launched at the Paris Climate Conference in 2015, when 20 countries got together at head of state level and said, we think we are going to work together to produce innovation that will help us tackling these challenges. And you'll notice that just to the right, or to the left on the picture, Barack Obama is Bill Gates, who just today has been telling everybody how meeting this challenge is going to be far more difficult than countering the impact of COVID. So that was 5 years ago. What they said was, we'll double how much we spend in 5 years. Well, the 5 years was up in December. And so last September, the countries involved agreed at ministerial level that they were going to plow on with this in a second phase, but they were going to do something a little bit different. And what they were going to do was pick some missions that were targeted specifically at the challenges that were encountered by countries in trying to meet these new aggressive emissions reductions targets. And those are currently being discussed and agreed, but at the bottom are some examples of what they're going to do. And you'll see that in there is hydrogen, cities, that's the built environment, the bioeconomy, decarbonising industry, shipping, and renewable power is not about developing better wind turbines. It's about saying, how do you operate systems if all you've got is intermittent renewables? And that takes you into the area of storage. Each of those missions is going to have a specific target of performance that they're going to achieve, and they're going to be built around public-private alliances. Now, as we get to the end, I just wanted to bring up what I've called the hidden emissions. So these are two plots which show for China and the United Kingdom the dark line is the annual emissions as represented in treaties. These are what are called territorial emissions, how much greenhouse gas comes out of your borders. The red line is what's called consumption-based emissions. And you will see on the left for the UK, if we look at consumption-based emissions, which is the carbon footprint of everything that we consume, irrespective of where that carbon was emitted, that those are considerably higher by a factor of something in the region of 35 to 40% of our territorial emissions. And that's because we buy so much stuff from other countries, and that stuff is fairly carbon intensive in its production. Compare it with China on the other side, and you'll see that they emit more from their territory than they themselves generate in their lifestyle. And that shows the role of China in the international supply chain. We see a lot of emissions in China that are explicitly to produce stuff that we use. So I'm going to finish on that. I just want to summarize very quickly the main points. And the main points really is that in the middle there, the light bulb, electricity is not the problem. We've seen towards the bottom with intermittent renewables, we can do a lot of stuff. We have, through the reports of the IPCC and the climate scientists, got fairly compelling evidence that without dramatic changes, however, in our emissions, we're going to see degrees of warming that are not going to be particularly good. So in order to tackle that, we've got a number of things to do. One of the points that I've tried to hint at through this talk is to say, as shown by the lady with the chemical formula there, essentially, we're going to have to do an enormous lot of innovation to provide solutions that will enable us to meet this. We do not have all the answers at the moment. We have the intent, we have the target, but we don't have the answers. And one specific example that I used is nuclear, just to highlight that it may seem like an answer, but in reality, for that last part there labeled bills, it isn't, because at the moment it simply costs more than anybody is prepared to pay. So there's quite a bit to do. There's a lot of options. We don't actually have the pathway fully determined at the moment, but hopefully over the coming year, we're going to find some of that coming out from the government. And with that, I will say thank you very much for your attention. And I will stop there, and I will stop sharing my screen and give you the chance to ask any questions you might have.
Oh, thank you very much. That was a fantastic talk. I talked for pretty much everyone here. I have plenty of questions, though. If you do have a question, please do put it in the comments and we'll get to them. So you talked about transport being a problem which has been well tackled. You talked about industrial problems require innovation, and you need to think about higher heats, like higher heats from power stations, etc. Though we've sort of skipped over aviation, is that one which you just don't see there's any solution to? Because that was one of the ones which didn't decrease in time as dramatically as the others.
So in the 10-point plan, I touched on that very briefly in that something called Jet Zero, which is the UK name for zero emissions aviation. There are two approaches to aviation. One is the idea that any sustainable fuel that you can produce from biomass would be used for aviation because it's so difficult to do anything else. But the numbers don't quite add up. If you look at everything you want to use your biomass for, there's not enough to use it for all those bits of BECCS, biomass energy with carbon capture and storage, and aviation. So the other route that's being explored is the possible use of hydrogen as a fuel for regional aircraft. So Airbus say they're going to have a hydrogen-fueled Airbus operating in Europe somewhere between 2030 and 2035. There are others saying that ammonia is a better way forward. So there's a UK company called Reaction Engines Limited in Oxford trying to develop that. And then many of the oil companies believe that developing a sustainable fuel is a better route forward. So it will still come. But you may know that there was a hydrogen-fueled 6-seater aircraft flown in the UK in November last year, and that company is currently developing a 19-seater aircraft, and they believe that they can get enough hydrogen inside the aircraft for it to run on hydrogen over the ranges that those aircraft serve.
Yeah, that is particularly interesting. Hydrogen's it introduces so many new problems because storing it, it's such a small molecule, it manages to escape any tank you leave it in. Isn't that right?
Well, not quite any tank. Tanks have been developed for storage on vehicles, which are basically composite tanks, and it struggles to get through organic materials. So the plastic pipes that are now used to distribute gas, they can keep hydrogen very well. The problem is not so much the propensity of the molecule to get out. The problem really is the fact that you've either got to compress it to very high pressures. I mean, car tanks currently are somewhere either 350 or 700 bar. 350 is the normal level, or you've got to liquefy it. That's minus 253 Celsius. So they're challenging things to do. I mean, the problem with storing hydrogen is not so much that you can't do it, but the mass of the storage system very often dominates the mass of the stored quantity. The best that's been done is the hydrogen storage tanks for the Ariane rocket. That carries a total of 24.5 tons of liquid hydrogen, and the storage system weighs 5.5 tons. And that's the best mass to energy ratio of any hydrogen storage system.
Yeah, it sounds like it's just it's very up to scale. If it's a massive, there's a large container, it's probably going to improve the efficiency of the weight. Sorry, I have a question from Ben. Do you think that for assets such as ships, which have long lifetimes, that these blanket aggressive policies are applicable or realistic?
Sorry, what policies? Blanket?
Aggressive policies.
Aggressive. Okay.
Shipping.
So with any long lifetime asset, you've always got a problem because it depends whether it's capable of being upgraded. In a ship, which is run predominantly on low speed compression ignition engines, they run at typically about 400 RPM, then the idea that you could switch to having an ammonia fuel system is not too incredible. It might involve some modification, but modifying the engine on a ship is going to be a lot easier than building a new ship. I mean, these low-speed engines run on any kind of rubbish, to be perfectly honest. So you've got some engineering to do, but not a lot. The real issue is whether you've got the infrastructure in ports, because it's no good rocking up at some port in Indonesia and finding they haven't got an ammonia tank if your ship runs on ammonia. At the moment, any port has got an infrastructure for bunker fuel, which is the low-grade diesel that these things run on. So the question is, how do you get the infrastructure out there so that ships can refuel and that it's handled in a safe way? You don't get the problems. I mean, ammonia can, as we saw in the Lebanon, be the source of some fairly horrendous explosions if you're not careful. Now, we know how to run ammonia. We've been shifting ammonia around for a long time, but it's taking it into a totally different sector.
Cool, that's a good answer. So we have from Maxim, have there been any considerations towards artificial cooling strategies? For example, spraying reflective surfaces to reflect the heat in order to artificially cool the climate?
So yes, is the answer. The solar radiation management has been one of the issues. So there are two ways that you do it. You either do it at the global scale and do it in the upper atmosphere. The challenge with that is there's a lot of concern about unintended and unpredicted consequences of putting stuff in the atmosphere and how long does it stay there. In terms of our own built infrastructure, then obviously that's part of the refurbishment of buildings, putting claddings on that can either absorb heat or deflect heat depending upon what you need. So there's consideration at both those scales. The latter is feasible and can be done. The former is credible, but by no means at a point where you could expect to get international agreement to actually do it. I mean, if you start spraying stuff into the high atmosphere, you get a lot of political and diplomatic problems.
Yeah, yeah, I heard something, but they have done something. There've been tests as well to form clouds artificially, which also help reflect.
But you have to put stuff up there to cause the clouds to form. That's the problem. It's what happens to the stuff once the clouds have gone away.
No, yeah. Okay, so we have a question from Jordan. I do feel bad taking and doing the questions for people. If you would like to take over, you're welcome.
Yeah, okay, I'll just ask it. I was just going to ask, like, why HS2 is being like shunned by like environmental people, because isn't like on trains better than cars for transport?
That's a really good point. The answer to that is that if you do the sums on the energy efficiency of a high-speed train, because the thing about trains is they're quite heavy, and they take a lot of energy to move around. So if you take something like Eurostar, the Eurostar train, or at least the original one, has got an installed propulsion capacity of 12 megawatts, and it runs with a power consumption of about 8 megawatts when it's cruising. So it's a very high consuming device because of the weight and because of the speed it goes at. If you compare that with a reasonably efficient family saloon with 4 people in it, and compare it over a 400-kilometer range, the car wins in terms of emissions, even with looking at current electricity mix versus petrol emissions or diesel emissions. If you were to look at a battery vehicle of that form against a train, it may well be that the emissions are going to be the same. The train will probably use more energy per passenger kilometer than the car will if the car's fully loaded. If the car's empty, of course, the equation changes. So it's a bit marginal. The real value of trains is the fact that they tend to reduce congestion quite a lot. Although there's some very interesting work it's worth pursuing that's been done actually at Cambridge, looking at what the performance would be of fully automated cars on a motorway if you could control the motion of the car and platoon the cars in such a way that they could go at much closer distances. And that work suggests that that would actually give you more capacity at much lower cost than you can possibly do using a rail line. I mean, trains have to run 3 minutes apart just because of the safety concerns. So a lot of the track isn't being used most of the time. The advantage of the work that John Miles did at Cambridge was he was saying, well, if you do this, you get much higher utilization of the infrastructure. So it's the question is still out.
Very nice. And Daniel, would you like to ask your question?
A question about what countries like Britain, who have this big discrepancy between their imported emissions and their territorial emissions, are doing to compute that and to present it in the national accounts such that they're giving a fair picture of what their responsibility is for their emissions.
So the brief answer is they're doing nothing whatsoever about it. So the challenge here comes down to one of international treaties rather than anything else. And the problem is nobody could agree on a fair way of measuring consumption-based emissions. Territorial emissions are easier to measure. More importantly, they're much easier to monitor and police because you can do, sort of first law of thermodynamics balance equations on what goes into across a border and what comes out in a way that you find it much more difficult to do with consumption-based emissions. So the issue is not one that the problem is not particularly recognized at the moment. The real issue is whether or not you could ever turn it into an international agreement that anyone would sign.
Brilliant. No, so you're saying that the UK really doesn't have any kind of intentions on holding companies accountable for emissions?
No, I didn't say that
Oh,
at all. No,
sorry.
no, companies are going to be held to account for their emissions under the current internationally agreed regulations. So could you do it differently? The answer is yes, you could. Can you get people to agree to do it differently? Because there's no good a single country, whether it's the UK or somebody else, just setting up their own rules and nobody else follows them. So it does come down to pragmatically, what can you get an international agreement to settle on? And that's what things like the COP conference in November is all about. I mean, COP is going to, this year will be all about what targets will you give for intermediate periods? What commitments will you make up to 2050? And then what rules will we agree we will use to check that we're all doing what we've said we will do?
Okay. And Jordan's got a question.
Yeah, just so you said that like the cost of the getting the whatever measures were for the target of 2050 no net emissions was like what, 1 to 2% of GDP or something. Well, I mean, I might be being naive here, but like however much is being spent at the moment on COVID, like dealing with COVID, isn't it way more than that anyway? So surely we can. It's not that much to pay for something that is potentially going to have even more impact on like our lives.
Well, let me predict what the answer would be rather than give you a personal opinion. The answer would be that COVID is a singular instance that's caused a crisis to which money is being spent to avoid it in the expectation that we'll come through and go back to something looking like a normal life. The cost on the economy is an ongoing cost under the current projections to say that essentially we would need to devote on an ongoing basis 1 to 2% of GDP into this area. Now, I'm not sure in GDP terms exactly what the COVID response has cost, because a lot of it is cash flow rather than expenditure. So if you look at some of the money that's been given, it's been given in loans to businesses that are repayable. It's been given in temporary support over fixed periods. So I think that would be the argument, that they're two different things. However, the argument that I think pertains to what you're saying is, if you look at the costs and the risks of the climate increasing in temperature to the degree that the predictions are, that the cost to GDP of that is likely to be the predominant factor. Now, the 1 to 2%, when you talk to the people that do these numbers, I've never got an answer out of them to say, if we look at the avoided cost of climate change by taking action and the cost of the actions, are you saying that it's going to cost us 1 to 2% more than the impact of climate change? Or are you saying that the cost will be 1 to 2% and you've not worked out or allowed for the impacts of climate change? No answer to that so far. So I can only give you a partial answer myself. I try to limit how much I talk to economists because I find it's not good for your health.
I can imagine that. I have a question about diet, actually. I'm quite interested. So the net zero model, which you showed us, showed a smaller proportion of carbon emissions caused by diet. Is that implying that it does require a change in diet for people in order to reach those targets?
Yeah, I think the way to think about net zero is that it's really a commitment to fundamentally change the structure of international economies and also lifestyles particularly for the Western world. So the thing about diet is that, first of all, if we look at the Western world, so that's not just the UK, but many of the other developed countries, we have very high calorie intakes, but they're also very expensive calories in that we choose to use a lot of them through meat products of one form or another. Now, to get a fixed number of calories into a person through a non-meat route takes about 1/3 of the emissions that putting it in through a meat route does. There's also a number of other consequences, which is certainly keeping cattle particularly means that you've got enormous levels of water consumption in a number of parts of the world simply to keep the cattle alive by providing fodder and grazing, as well as the amount that they take. So the implication behind this is that almost certainly we will find that our residual agricultural emissions, if you lump food into agriculture, will be considerably above what we're able to tolerate in a net zero environment unless we see a change in lifestyle and a change in diet. So I hope you sort of find the prospect of vegetarian food attractive because that will be the case. However, if we think about the innovation side, there's an awful lot of work at the moment looking at the development of meat-like protein from factory systems, and this uses plant-based feedstock. It uses energy, of course, but you hope you get out from the sun to actually produce simulated animal protein. And that gives you the potential to provide the same nature of food with a similar taste and texture that we currently get from animals through another route. So there's both diet change, but there's also a supply side option of actually producing what it is that we have a taste for through different routes.
Yeah. Oh, thank you very much. If there aren't any more questions, I think that will be it. Thank you very much. That was a brilliant talk. I really enjoyed it myself. And yeah, I wish you safe travels.
Okay, thank you very much, guys. And I hope you all get on well in pursuing studies through lockdown. Can't be easy.
Cool.
Okay, nice talking to you. All the best.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.